In Chapter 8 of our study of Introductory Economics, we look at market structures. As you may recall in Chapter 5, I mentioned that we will be taking a closer look at the characteristics of markets and how they're organized. This is the chapter that we do that. Here's our roadmap for study in this chapter. We're going to start off with taking a look at how markets organize themselves into larger organizations, if you will, or structures. Then we'll take a look at typical barriers to entry to any market. And then sometimes markets actually shift between those larger organizations or structures, and we'll look at the causes for this. And then we'll take a look at the role of government regulation and deregulation and the impact it has on both markets and the larger market structures. In this chapter, we will also look at the characteristics of the four market structures, and they are perfect competition, monopolistic competition, and that's an interesting phrase, monopolistic competition. Many people question it as being an oxymoron. If you're familiar with what an oxymoron is two terms that are in violent conflict with each other. And what we have here is a phrase, monopolistic competition, where the first word, the root, is in the word monopoly, which means one, and the other, competition, meaning many. So how can you have one and many? But we'll explain that once we get to looking at the characteristics of this structure. And then we'll look at oligopolies and a monopoly as a market structure. So let's get started. Market structures are a method of classifying and organizing markets. And when you do this, there are four major considerations to take into account. First, the number of consumers that are participating in the market, the number of suppliers that are participating in the market, the types of products and services that are offered by the suppliers to the market, and whether there are barriers of entry and what types of barriers of entry there may be to a market. These four things are the considerations that help us organize certain markets into larger group categories called market structures. However, to begin the classification process, you must also be able to distinguish between companies, industries, and markets. And here's a convenient way to do that. It's companies or firms that collectively form industries. And industries collectively form markets. And it's the markets that we then take and put into similar markets into market structures. Let's look at a couple of examples to illustrate the point. Here we have three companies that participate in an industry. It happens to be the agricultural industry. Now, the agricultural industry drives certain markets, one of which happens to be the produce market. Here's the second example with three more companies. Some of these I'm sure are very familiar to you. They participate in the automotive industry. Now, the automotive industry has a number of markets within it, or it's associated with. The subcompact market for transportation, the truck market, and the SUV market as an example. Now, with both of these examples that I've provided, I haven't taken it as far as talking about then which market structure the markets are organized into. And we'll get to that here in a few moments. And before we take markets and put them into market structures and look at the characteristics, I want to first cover a couple of other concepts that I mentioned earlier when talking about the roadmap of our study in this chapter. The first is barriers of entry to any market. And there are three major potential barriers to entry of a market. The first is startup costs and expenses. And let me use the analogy of, let's say you had an idea to start a car company. Automotive companies are very expensive to start. You have a lot to invest in terms of assembly lines, materials, and so forth. They're very capital intensive. Unless you have access to be able to raise a lot of money to be able to do that, that's a major barrier to you getting a car company up and running, the startup costs. A second potential barrier that people run into quite often is skills and knowledge. And let me continue on with the car company example, if you will. Let's say you happen to be an engineer and you happen to like cars and trucks an awful lot, and you have a great idea for a new type of car or truck, and that is the impetus for you to be looking to start your own car company. But because you are an engineer and you might have a great idea, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have expertise in all the other areas that would be needed to run your car company. For example, manufacturing and finance and marketing and sales. And a lot of times people find it difficult to find the right skills and knowledge in people to join the organization and get it up and running. So that winds up in some cases being a barrier to entry as well. The third barrier to entry has to do with patents or particularly property rights. And again, let me continue with my analogy of a car company. If you had a particular idea for a type of technology unique to the car that you wanted to build, and you find out that somebody else owns the property rights, or in other words, had the idea before you did and patented it, you would be prohibited from using it, and that obviously would be a major barrier to you getting your company up and running. Again, before moving on to examine each of the market structures themselves, I want to cover yet another concept that I had mentioned earlier, and that's the things that can cause markets to actually shift from one structure to another. And it basically boils down to three things. Here's the first one. It's a concept that was introduced by the very famous economist in the early 1900s, Joseph Schumpeter. It's the concept of creative destruction. It's actually a dynamic process that works in the marketplace. It's when entrepreneurs enter a market with innovations that wind up significantly changing the products and services within that market, or actually creates a new market, and also potentially how business is conducted within the market. And Schumpeter said, and this is very true, this is how capitalism works best and how long-term economic growth is promoted and sustained. If you're not familiar with the words innovation and sustain, let's take a quick look at them. Innovations meaning to innovate, to begin or introduce something new, create, start, invent. Thomas Edison was one of the innovative people in history. Sustained, a verb here to keep up or take care of, maintain, uphold. Used in another way, the soldiers were able to sustain the fight until they took control of the territory. Let's take a little bit deeper look now at some of the processes behind creative destruction. The creative destruction process is all about entrepreneurs coming up with innovations. And that naturally leads to the question, well, what type of innovations might we be talking about? And I'm going to give you the four most common types of innovations that we see in creating new markets or disrupting currently existing markets. The first type of innovation is new technology. This probably isn't a surprise to you. A classic example of this is when the microprocessor was invented in the mid-1900s. It actually spawned a whole new set of markets in the information age in general, computer systems, communication systems, and the like, a classic example. I also mentioned Thomas Edison a few moments ago. Think about his technological creations also spurred new industries and created new markets during his time. Second would be new products. Now, many times new products are associated with the innovation and new technology, but not always so. A great example of this is the success of the Starbucks organization taking a product or a good that's been around for centuries, literally coffee, and putting a new twist on it and presenting it in a new way. So while most often new products are associated with technology advancements, it's not always particularly the case, and it certainly contributes to the creative destruction process. New marketing ideas to take advantage of changes in what we call demographics, which are the characteristics of populations that are used to identify markets. I'll go back to the Starbucks example here. Here we had a combination of a new product idea, repackaging coffee in a different way, but it was also based upon new marketing and because of changes in demographics in our society to take advantage of promoting the new product. And the fourth type of innovation is the new use of resources. Many times this too is associated with the creation of new technology. A great example of this was when the car was invented, the combustion engine found a new use of the resource of petroleum, from being a lighting and small heating resource to actually promoting the development of the transportation industry throughout the world. Here are a couple of other quick and fun examples to look at of creative destruction in action. And we'll do them simultaneously here, looking at technology and products on one side and changes in marketing and demographics on the other side a little bit. And, there was at one time that we got our music or played our music on record players with vinyl records and so forth, and that dates back a long time ago. And also we had, with some advancements in technology associated with this, availability to go and rent videotapes from organizations like Blockbuster to watch a movie. And then as things changed on the technology side with the invention of the microchip and its related technology products, we dumped the record players in favor of CDs and CD players, and actually the videotape business busted up organizations like Blockbuster when Netflix came into existence and was able to deliver DVDs to the home for you. You didn't have to go down to the video rental store and rent a tape. Also, the quality of the product in terms of the DVD was better, and really they took advantage of marketing and changes in demographics to make their business successful. And that has even progressed further today by pressure, like with organizations such as Hulu, putting pressure on Netflix on video streaming, and that market continues to change literally as we speak. And back over on the other side where we get our music from, the form factor for the technology continually gets smaller and smaller, with the CD player being followed by the MP3 player and the like. So these are some fun, simple examples of the creative destruction process and how it works. The two other things that can cause a market to shift market structures is when the government either gets into or out of the act. Government regulation to control business practices through legislation and enforcement can cause significant changes in the way industries, businesses, meaning companies and firms, and markets work, and can affect this kind of change. Also, when the government gets out of the act through deregulation, where they remove business restrictions either on an industry or firms, and that usually occurs as a result of either an industry change or more commonly a technology change coming about where the regulation is not needed. The deregulation happens far less than the involvement or the regulation side. And we'll look at these more as we move through our chapters in our study. Now it's time for us to start looking at the details of the four market structures, and we're going to start with perfect competition. However, before I give you a working definition of a perfectly competitive market, let me make a recommendation to you. If you haven't tried grilled corn, do so. It's one of my favorite barbecue items, and it's great. So here's your working definition for a perfectly competitive market. It's a market structure with a very large number of firms or businesses producing essentially the same product. For a market to be considered perfectly competitive as a market structure, four conditions must be met. Here's the first. Hundreds or thousands of both producers and buyers must be participating in the market. Secondly, the producers supplying product to the market offer identical products. We call them commodities. A commodity is a product that is considered generally the same no matter who produces it or consumes it. And third, buyers and producers in this market are well informed about the products. The fourth condition that must exist for perfect competition is that the producers must be able to enter and leave the market freely, and there should be very few barriers to entry to the market. Now, perfectly competitive markets have three characteristics. Here's the first one. Efficiency. They are highly efficient markets, and that's because of the enormous amount of competition within the market. It keeps prices and production costs low. The second characteristic of a perfectly competitive market is that prices are the lowest possible and are just enough to keep all those producers interested in supplying to the market. We know this is important because of what we learned in Chapter 6 about what happens when price gets too low and suppliers wind up leaving a market. So to promote lots of producers participating here, we have to get the price to the lowest possible but still keep them engaged and interested in supplying. The third characteristic of a perfectly competitive market is the firms or the producers are really price takers. They have no ability to control the price of the good that's offered in this market. Some examples of perfectly competitive markets are the produce market and all types of produce, and the dairy industry. Those of you who are using one of our custom study guides will notice at the back of the study guide we provide a template for a little graphic organizer that has proven to be a very convenient and productive tool. What we do with this is at the end of looking at each market structure, we simply list out the major characteristics of the structure, and this provides a very convenient place to compare the characteristics all in one location. And we're going to start by listing the highlights of perfect competition over here on the left. But before I do, let me make one other point. As we move through our market structures, we're actually going to move from perfect competition all the way over to the right side of this graphic organizer and next take a look at monopolies. And the reason we do that is because By looking at the two extreme ends of the market structures, perfect competition where we have lots of competitors and a monopoly where we have one dominant supplier to a market, the two other market structures, monopolistic competition and oligopoly, fall in between these two and are actually a mix of the two extremes, the perfect competition and monopoly. So it makes sense to define the endpoints first and then come into the middle, and they'll make more sense to you. So let's go ahead and list the highlights of the perfectly competitive market. Remember, we have thousands of firms here supplying the market. Those firms, businesses, are price takers. They have little to no ability to control price. The types of goods that are offered in a perfectly competitive market are commodities, the same no matter who produces or consumes them. There are very few barriers to entry or departure from a perfectly competitive market. And examples are produce, all types, and dairy. Now let's move on to the monopoly. So here's your working definition for a monopoly as a market structure. A monopoly market structure is when a single supplier is in a market with barriers of entry that are too high for another supplier to enter it. And contrary to the common belief in our society, monopolies are not illegal. The reason most people think they are illegal is they don't understand the specifics of antitrust legislation that has been passed in our country, and also in part because the concept of monopoly is quite often mistaught in history classes. And let me give you an example. It's a real simple one. If I design and invent a product that I invest a lot of money in, and let's say it's a technically complex product, not too many people understand, and I introduce that product to the marketplace, and my hunch about whether people would be interested in or not is correct, and I start to make a lot of money and I build a successful business. And nobody else decides to make a competing product and compete with me in the market that I have created. The question is, should I be penalized for that, for coming up with a good idea and being successful? In other words, does the sheer size of the business that I build and the market dominance that I might have as a result of nobody competing with me, where I've established myself as a monopoly, a single supplier, should that get me in trouble with the law? And the answer to that is no. As long as I do not wind up misbehaving in the way I run my business, and I'll tell you more about that here in a few minutes. But I want to cover a couple of other things about monopolies first before I talk about where monopolies could get people that are running a business that is a monopoly in a market could wind up getting themselves in trouble. As I mentioned a moment ago, before I explain how monopolies could potentially get themselves in trouble, I want to cover a couple of other concepts with regard to monopolies that you really need to understand. And here's the first one. A monopoly enjoys what we call economies of scale. And economies of scale is a concept that really every business wants to be able to take advantage of. But a monopoly, as I'll explain why in a moment, really gets to enjoy economies of scale usually pretty quickly. Economies of scale, the working definition for it is that average costs fall for each additional unit that it produces, and the business never reaches the second stage of rising costs. Now that's certainly a mouthful, but let me give you a chart to illustrate this concept, number one, and number two, then talk about an example, a simple example to illustrate what we're talking about here. So here's the graphic representation of what of the first part of what I just talked about here. It's where we have a graph that shows the unit cost of production on the left side, or the vertical axis, and output on the other. And here's a tip for you. One of the best ways to think about this: economies of scale is very closely related to the concept of quantity discounts, which is something that everybody can relate to. You know, it's the more you buy of something, you're liable to get a price break on it. Well, let's say, and I'll use my example here, my simple example. Let's say I came up with the bright idea for whiteboard markers. And when I designed my product, I kept things pretty simple. And I used only black ink and introduced my product into the market, and nobody decided to compete with me. And I was recognized as a good idea, and people started to buy it. Now, if I go back to the beginning of my invention of my marker, when I was designing it, the initial first marker, I went to an ink supplier and got them to sign what we call a non-disclosure agreement, and showed them the product that I was thinking of making. And I wanted to order ink from this ink manufacturer, and I was looking for a price for the ink. And what I'd like you to think about for a second, if I told the ink supplier that I was only going to make 10 of the whiteboard markers, do you think I would get, and therefore only order a gallon or two of ink from him, do you think that he would have given me a price break? And I think you know the answer to that: probably not. However, if I went to the ink manufacturer and I showed him the whiteboard marker and said I was going to make 10 million of the markers, I would think I'd get the ink manufacturer's attention from a much stronger standpoint, and a willingness to engage me in talking about the price of supplying me the ink, particularly if the ink manufacturer could be the sole source supplier to me for the 10 million marker, the ink for the 10 million markers. So by producing a lot and being the only supplier in the market, the monopoly enjoys economies of scale, where that if I produce a tremendous amount, I can drive my unit cost of production down lower and lower and lower. Now, when a monopoly loses their monopoly in a market, they wind up having to adjust because they no longer have economies of scale. Let's say that somebody sees what I'm doing in the market and decides to compete with me, and they do something like enhancing the product by now offering colored whiteboard markers, where I was just offering black. Now, that's going to put a burden on me, because for me to compete effectively and be able to offer colors, which I would have to do competitively, it's going to force my cost up, because I'm going to have to now buy volumes of different colored inks. So by losing my monopoly, I would wind up reaching what we call the second stage of rising costs. Still have a competitive and profitable business, but I don't have the economies of scale that I once had when I was a sole provider in the market. Next, we're going to take a look at the 4 types of monopolies that exist. 2 of the 4 types occur as the result of the normal conduct of business in our economy, and the other 2 are government created and regulated, supposedly in the public's interest. And most citizens are not used to thinking about monopolies in relationship to them being government created, but I'll explain the concepts here in a moment. Let's first take the 2 that are created as the result of normal business conduct. The first is what we'll call a normal business monopoly, usually achieved by inventing something new and creating or capturing a market. A good example of a normal business monopoly that has been created would be Microsoft in the operating system software business for computers. A second business-created monopoly is a business-created sub-monopoly called a franchise. We'll look at the details of franchises a little bit more in Chapter 9 when we look at business organizations and explain how franchises work. But technically, a franchise is given to somebody to run a business in a defined geographic area, and they have all the rights to that business, meaning marketing, logo, and the company concepts in that defined area. Now for the two government-created and regulated monopolies. And we'll start with the patent. A patent is a license that gives an inventor exclusive rights to sell their idea for a period of time and obviously make money on it. A license, as a subset of that, is a government-issued right to do something. Now, a patent is really important from a number of perspectives, but first let me give you an example of how patents work from a monopoly perspective. And the best example I could think of is talking about the pharmaceutical industry. You may have heard people talk about name brand drugs and generic drugs. Well, most name brand drugs start out as being marketed under patents, and name brand drugs usually are at a very high price. And the reason for that is the name brand drugs are still under patent, where a company or an inventor has the exclusive right to sell the drug, for which they charge a premium because they're the only supplier of the drug to the market. Now, these exclusive rights last for a period of time, and that varies by the type of business and the industry. If I'm not mistaken, in the pharmaceutical industry, it roughly runs for about 7 years, maybe even 10 years at most, where the company that invents a particular drug has the exclusive rights to it, and they effectively can charge any amount and effectively recoup their investment that they put into the development of the drug. And once the period of time runs out on the patent, the molecular design for the drug is open for public inspection. And what many other companies do is they copy it and introduce their own version of the drugs. And this is when we get generic drugs available in the marketplace. Now, from our experience in learning things about supply and demand, you know what happens to in a market when supply is increased, prices come down, and that is why generic drugs are offered at lower prices than name brand drugs. It relates to the patent protection and the monopoly rights given to the inventor. Now, before we move on to the second type of government-created monopoly, one other word about patents. Patents are a good thing in offering that monopoly and exclusive right protection, because if that didn't exist and we didn't have that type of support and laws on the books, there would be less incentive for entrepreneurs to develop new things that they could leverage to make money off of. So removing patent capabilities would significantly dampen the creative destruction and innovation process that we've looked at so intently here, and is also a very important part to the free market system. Okay, the second type of government created and regulated monopoly is something that's called a natural monopoly. This is where the government, based upon particular characteristics of a market, sets up one firm to manage it, where the market would run most efficiently when one large firm provides all the output. And you may be asking, why would the government do this? I'm going to give you some reasons for this through the illustration of 4 examples. But I'm going to start with these two, public water and cable services, to talk about some of the most fundamental reasons why the government would do this. And then with the other 2 in a moment, explain some of the more complex and deeper reasons why the government chose to do this in a number of cases. Let me start with public water. Again, most of the water companies around the United States serving geographic areas are natural monopolies, and the public water system has been set up for the public's interest to be handled by one business in a geographic area, so that it can be conveniently and efficiently regulated and inspected by the state and federal governments. And the reason we do this is to ensure the quality of the water supply. For example, if we had multiple water companies serving geographic areas and bringing in competition, businesses would be tempted to cut corners to ensure profitability, possibly, and in cutting corners, maybe compromise the quality of the water supply. And we just can't have that as a society. So in those cases, we invest in the government's ability to supervise the water system very probably, so we have no questions over the quality of the water that's available to our communities. And that's the way we can run things most efficiently and ensure the quality. The second example, cable services, there was a different objective for, and there are a small number of cable companies that around the United States that have the license to be the sole provider in their particular markets. And in this case, it was not over necessarily quality of product or security reasons, but was to help a cable provider reach economies of scale, which we talked about before quickly, by allowing certain companies to be the sole provider in a market so that the technology could be distributed as quickly through our locales and municipalities as quickly as possible, and allow the company to drive home economies of scale and bring the costs of service down. So in this case, it was in the public's interest, determined by the government, to enhance a set of services and the distribution and the availability of them to our society, which in turn would make our overall society that much more productive and promote economic growth. So a different rationale, but again in the public's interest. Now the other 2 examples I'm going to provide to you fell subject to this other thing you need to be aware of, is that new technologies have also been known to kill the need for natural monopolies that have been set up by the government. And I'll give you, in these other 2 examples, will illustrate how this has taken place, and look at them. They're very, very interesting. Here's our first example of a natural monopoly that has been eliminated by new technology. Some of you may know that the United States Postal Service was originally set up as a natural monopoly to promote economic growth. The idea here was to lower the cost of trade through economies of scale and provide for faster, more efficient communications and trade through one system. So could any of you guess what technologies may have eliminated the need to have mail service set up as a natural monopoly? See if you guessed any of the following: telecommunications, the various aspects of the transportation systems that have developed, as well as the internet. In fact, it was these technologies that have also generated the creation of other businesses that have taken or are in the process of taking the place of the mail service. Businesses such as UPS, FedEx, DHL, and others. The second example of a natural monopoly being eliminated by new technology is the telecommunications market. And before I explain what the rationale was behind setting telecommunications up as a natural monopoly, I'd like to explain what you're seeing here in this picture. And I'll go back to the late 1800s when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. What a wonderful invention. It had enormous benefits that was able to provide to people personally in terms of communication and contact with family members, and also businesses in terms of being able to reduce costs by communicating with suppliers as well as customers. Now, Alexander Graham Bell had developed a patent for his telephone, but there were a lot of entrepreneurial people that looked at the device and said, wow, I also could make a lot of money with a device like this, and found ways around the patent by effectively making products that worked similarly but were different than Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. And a little problem arose with some of those other products in that they didn't necessarily work in conjunction with the other telecommunications products available at the time. In other words, we wound up having separate systems in many cases that wouldn't communicate with each other. Now, the telecommunications business took off, and a lot of people bought telecommunication services and telephones early on. But eventually, and I should say, that helped promote a lot of economic growth. But eventually, they reached a point of diminishing returns in that if you needed to communicate with a lot of people, you may wind up needing to have a number of different types of access to different types of telecommunication systems and products. And that eventually became cost prohibitive. So in the long run, it became more complex. And as a result of systems needing their own support structure and not communicating with each other, and in some cases, businesses having to have more than one, we had situations develop in our cities that look very similar to this picture, where we had multiple lines for different services being run to different locations. Now, in addition to this, as you can see, this looked like a very complex environment. This also wound up creating potential public safety hazards, because picture this, if you will. If, let's say, there was an accident where a horse cart, or eventually when cars became available in trucks, you had a car or truck wind up hitting one of these telecommunications poles and knocking it down. That created quite a scene on a city block, as you might imagine by seeing the number of wires that we're dealing with here. And it created both public safety and health hazards based upon the system that had been developed. So let's take a look at what led us and what the rationale was behind creating a natural monopoly for telecommunications, and then look at the technologies that wound up eliminating the need for this. Telecommunications was set up as a natural monopoly for three reasons. The first was to improve public health and safety. Second, similar to what we saw with the Postal Service, to lower costs through economies of scale, and to continue to promote further economic growth. The third was the strategic value to the American society to reach something that was called universal service, access for everyone. This was the fundamental concept that I talked about a few moments ago when I was referring to the cable companies being given licenses as natural monopolies as well. But telecommunication service was a much higher priority to provide access for everyone for all the obvious reasons. So let's see if you can guess what technologies broke up the need for having telecommunications as a natural monopoly. This guessing might be a little bit tougher than the guess that we made for the United States Postal Service, but let's see. Here they are. The creation of the semiconductor, the creation of microwave communications, and effectively the use of and creation of coaxial cable as a communications facilitator. Now, these technologies becoming available, just like in the case of the Postal Service situation, these have created and spurred new businesses and new markets, for that matter. For example, the goods and services that were created as a result of this new technology included the computers that we have today, the internet companies and capabilities, other software companies, the high-tech toys that we enjoy, and all the way up through our cellular services that are available today. I would now like to come back to that subject of what gave monopolies a bad reputation, and in fact, what would get any business into trouble with the law. And what would are anti-competitive business practices. Anti-competitive business practices were first started to be addressed in the late 1800s when the government went after the business practices of John D. Rockefeller when he was running Standard Oil, and more recently against Bill Gates when he was the chairman of Microsoft. Once again, I want to reemphasize a very important point, and that is that size and market dominance as a monopoly does not get you in trouble with the law. What will get any business in trouble with the law, whether it's a monopoly or not, is engaging in anti-competitive business practices that restrain trade and competition. This is the Supreme Court's rule of reason guideline that they set forth in their decisions regarding the Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Acts of 1890 and 1914. This now naturally leads us to the next question, which is, what are anti-competitive business practices? And I'm going to give you insight to probably what's considered the four most common anti-competitive business practices that come up these days. And in doing so, I'm going to provide you with the definition for these business practices here. And be sure not to miss my stories that I'll be telling about these anti-competitive business practices in our course resource center. We don't have enough time to tell those stories here. I'll be outlining some real-world examples of how these have worked in recent years to further illustrate the point and deepen your understanding. So let's get the definitions down first. Here's the first one. It's called dumping. This is where a company gives away a product to gain market share or to protect some very valuable resources. One of the stories I'll be telling in the course resource center to illustrate how dumping works is the case against Microsoft. This is one of the things that Microsoft was convicted of in their antitrust lawsuit in the late 1990s. The second anti-competitive business practice that comes up quite frequently is predatory pricing. This is where a company sells at or below cost with the intent to crush a competitor or drive them out of a market. In fact, I'll be talking about two stories to illustrate predatory pricing, one of which is Microsoft again, because Microsoft in its antitrust suit was accused of doing both of these in combination, both dumping and predatory pricing, and it provided for a really interesting situation. The third type of anti-competitive business practice is called price fixing, and this is really a practice that comes up with regard to the market structure that's called an oligopoly, and we haven't gotten to that yet. That's next up on the list. What happens here is that the companies get together in the market and try to manipulate the market and control price and set price to maximize their profit. And I'll give you some examples about how this works when we get to the oligopoly descriptions here in a short while. And the fourth most common anti-competitive business practice that comes up these days is really a product of the information age revolution and the booming high-tech industry that started to take off in the 1980s and continues today. It's a practice that's called overhanging a market. In this case, you make false promises to cut off competitors. It's really a form of fraud, and I'll again be giving you some examples in the course resource center as to how this has actually worked in the high-tech industry. Now let's take a look at the three characteristics of a monopoly in action. Here's the first characteristic. Even if it does not engage in anti-competitive business practices, because of the uniqueness of its product offering, a monopoly probably has market power, which is the ability to control prices in the broad sense of things, and market output and limit competition by their dominance in the market. The second characteristic is that a monopoly will produce fewer goods at higher prices to maximize their profits. We commonly call them price seekers. A great example of this, again, is Microsoft. Once they develop a new operating system version, their cost of production comes down dramatically, and they really can take advantage these days of economies of scale in producing and distributing their operating system software. But because they're the dominant player in the market, and the fact that I think it's upwards of 98% of computer systems still run off of the Windows operating system, they can charge a premium for their product, and they do. As a matter of fact, I'd like to say they try to seek what the maximum pain threshold is for consumers in buying their product in terms of a willingness to pay. So there are certainly price seekers in an effort to maximize profits. The third characteristic is that monopolies make good use of what we call price discrimination, which is charging different prices to different groups of customers for the same product. Because monopolies have such enormous flexibility with regard to profit and therefore pricing, they want to make sure that no stone gets unturned in their dominance over submarkets, if you will. So in many cases where there's price sensitivity, and I'll use Microsoft as an example again, they want to dominate also in the education submarket, and the education submarket is more sensitive to pricing than other businesses. So they offer certain educational discounts on their operating software products and exercise price discrimination to make sure that they capture that submarket completely. Now, there are three requirements for price discrimination to be able to work. First, you obviously must have the market power to exercise this. Second, it's very helpful to have distinct customer groups, such as the example I provided, like targeting education. A third requirement is that, and this is a real important one, particularly in certain businesses, for example in high tech, it must be difficult to resell the goods that are provided. This can be affected through licensing and a few other ways to do it. Otherwise, the whole concept behind the price discrimination doesn't work. If you're giving a group a quantity discount or a certain discount because of price sensitivity, and then that group can go out and resell your product, it kind of defeats the purpose. So whatever product or service you have must be difficult to resell. This now brings us to an end of our look at monopolies, and those of you who are using the custom study guide can go to the organizer that we provided as part of the package, and we'll populate out here the highlights of our monopoly market structure. Remember, here we have one firm in the market that dominates it. They are price seekers. There are usually big barriers to entry to these markets that the monopoly dominates. They take advantage, more so than any businesses, of economies of scale. And an example for a natural monopoly would be public water, and a traditional business monopoly that happens naturally in the market and the economy would be Microsoft. Let's now move on to monopolistic competition. The third market structure that we'll look at is monopolistic competition. And here's your working definition for it. It's a market structure in which many companies compete in an open market to sell products which are similar but not identical. It's real important to understand that products can be substituted. Here's some examples of monopolistically competitive markets. The jeans market is monopolistically competitive. The automotive market falls into this category as well, as does lodging, hotels, and resorts. 4 conditions must exist for monopolistic competition. Here's the first. There needs to be many but limited number of firms participating in the market, usually 10 to 30. At least 10, could be higher than 30, but this is a pretty good range. Secondly, there are some barriers to entry to these markets. Third, these businesses do have slight control over price, not like the monopoly does, and certainly far more control than firms in a perfectly competitive market. And very importantly, the products are differentiated. And what we mean by differentiated, it means that there's distinction between the products. Differentiate, the root word here, means to modify or distinguish between. Alternative, as a related word. Here's a great use of it in a sentence. The company made changes in the products it made in an effort to differentiate itself from its competition. Monopolistically competitive markets have 5 characteristics to them. The first is that the firms participating in the markets focus on non-price competition, and they do this in 4 ways. As I illustrate the 4 ways, let's use the automotive market as an example. The first way is that they compete based upon physical characteristics of the product, what they look like. I think it's no surprise to you that the car companies put an awful lot into distinguishing how their product line looks from their competition. The second form of non-price competition is actually based upon location. Most communities in the United States have some car dealership somewhere close by to the community. However, they don't have all car dealerships. For example, BMW, which prices their products at a premium, doesn't put dealerships near or in communities where they think the income levels are not there to be able to support sales of their product line. A third way to compete on something other than price is by competing on service level and customer support. Let me use BMW and Mercedes as examples in this case. When you bring your car into one of their dealerships to have it serviced, you're very likely to get a loaner car for the day while the car is being worked on. Not every type of car dealership representing an automotive company does this type of thing, and they view it as a non-price competitive advantage in terms of servicing the customer. The fourth way is through advertising, trying to build image and status rather than competing on price. I guess the simplest example of this would be, if you can recall when you've had the television on or listening to the radio, if you've heard an ad for a BMW or a Mercedes dealership, I don't think I can recall ever anywhere in any of the ads that I've ever heard or seen where price of the product is mentioned. The second characteristic of monopolistically competitive markets is that prices for products in these markets will be higher than they are under perfect competition and obviously lower than in a monopoly situation. We call the firms or businesses in these markets price makers. The third characteristic is that demand for the products in these markets is usually elastic, and that's because of the substitution effect. Market output in total for these markets falls between the volume that's produced in perfect competition and what's produced in a monopoly market. An example here is we certainly produce more ears of corn as produce than we do cars, but yet we produce more cars these days than we do software packages. And the fifth characteristic is that firms generally have more profit margin flexibility than in perfectly competitive markets. This relates back to the businesses being price makers. This brings us to an end of our look at monopolistic competition as a market structure. And again, for those of you using a custom study guide, if you go to your summary organizer here, we'll list the highlights of that particular market structure. So in monopolistic competition, we generally have 10 to 30 firms participating in the markets. The businesses or firms in the markets are price makers. They do have some control over price. There are some barriers to entry. Some of these markets contain rather large businesses where significant investments need to be made to get into the business. And a real key here is that products can be substituted, and the firms in these markets work hard at differentiating their products. And a focus is on non-price competition. We talked about the characteristics of that and some examples, or an example of a monopolistically competitive market would be the automotive market. Let's move on now to the fourth market structure, which is the oligopoly. Our last market structure to look at is an oligopoly. An oligopoly is a market dominated by a few large firms that are very profitable organizations. In fact, this market structure looks more like an imperfect form of monopoly. Oligopolies have three characteristics. First, although there are usually only 8 to 9 at the most firms participating in the market, 4 to 5 of the firms usually produce 70 to 80% of the market output. Price competition in an oligopolic market is avoided at all costs. In fact, if one of the firms starts to engage in price competition, it will create chaos and lead to a very quick death for the firm. And lastly, the third characteristic, these are usually very large businesses with very unique product or service offerings. And based upon that, things like licenses, patents, and in many cases very high startup costs come into play as a characteristic for the firms. Let's take a look at some examples of markets that are oligopolies. We'll start with personal computers. When you stop to think about it, you can probably count on one hand the major players that supply 70 to 80% of the market output for personal computers. I suggest maybe Dell, HP, Apple, Lenovo, and then we really struggle after that to think of, the dominant suppliers to the market. So personal computer certainly applies. Telecommunication services, especially in the cellular world today, really there are only four choices. As a matter of fact, I can't even think of a fifth. They're listed here: Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile dominate the market. Airlines, especially for transcontinental flight services, really again on one hand, United, American, maybe JetBlue, Southwest, Delta, certainly a market that fits the oligopoly parameters. And if I make a point here about these first three examples I've given you, these are very capital-intensive industries that deal with highly technical products, in a lot of cases require licenses, need a lot of capital to get started up and maintained and run. A fourth example is local gasoline stations. Now, it may seem kind of odd, but it'll make more sense as we talk more about oligopolies here. And I have some examples towards the end of the chapter that we'll use to illustrate why local gasoline stations certainly fit this category. And by the way, take a look at those prices for gasoline. We'll probably never see those types of levels again in our lifetime, possibly. But anyway, these oligopoly markets are driven and controlled by something we call the dominant strategy theory. They're also known by two other names. That's the AKA. The dominant strategy theory is known as the Nash equilibrium, which is probably the most commonly recognized title for the theory, and also the prisoner's dilemma. Now, where does the term Nash equilibrium come from? Well, it comes from this fella. His name is John Nash. And interesting story about John Nash. He's one of the most brilliant mathematicians of the 1900s. As a matter of fact, he is the father and creator of the concept of game theory. And he won a Nobel Prize for economics based upon the work he did in developing game theory. And you might actually be familiar with his story, which is a rather unique one, because his story was highlighted as the subject of a film which was certainly nominated for Best Picture, and I believe actually did win the Academy Award for Best Picture, in which Russell Crowe played John Nash. The movie's name was A Beautiful Mind. So if you haven't seen that movie, I highly recommend that you take it in. It is a good movie. But back to game theory and the Nash equilibrium and the dominant strategy theory. Here's a working definition for the theory. It's when each participant in a market does not depend on what the other does in an effort to either minimize loss and maximize benefits or profits. Earlier in the chapter, when we were looking at anti-competitive business practices, the third one that we looked at was price fixing. And it's price fixing that comes up most often in markets that are oligopolies. And it's how the firms in those markets wind up getting themselves in trouble. When the firms in the market gather together to price fix, they're effectively creating a trust. What a trust is, it's formed when firms work together informally. They don't announce a specific structure or organization to engage in collusion to do the price fixing or bar competition in some other way. If you're not familiar with the word collusion, it's a secret agreement between two or more persons for a deceitful or illegal purpose. Synonyms are plot, scheme, related words, deceive. Here it's used in a business sentence. The accountants and company executives colluded to cheat the stockholders. Now, a lot of times, the formation of trusts for collusion purposes to do things like price fix or bar competition are very difficult in many cases to pin on the firms that are participating in this. And I'll give you an example of one where it has been supposed that there may be a trust going on but never proven. Many people in the high-tech business believed for a long time that there was something called the Wintel Alliance, a unholy, if you will, trust that was established between Microsoft and Intel to bar competition from the market, where Microsoft was optimizing its software to run best on products that use the Intel chipset technology. And while this was actually in some cases demonstratable, they were never able to pin a trust formation on Microsoft and Intel. So a lot of times this is a very, very difficult thing to pin on the companies. Now, an organizational form that's also illegal under the Sherman-Clayton Antitrust Acts in this country is the formation of cartels, and they're closely associated with a trust in the sense that a cartel is really a trust, but it's out in the public. A cartel is a formal organization that publicly announces that it's going to do price fixing and production fixing. Now, cartels, as I mentioned a moment ago, are completely illegal here in the United States. However, they're perfectly legal in the international market because there are no laws that govern this or that can even be enforced to govern it. Now, cartels only survive as long as the members get along with each other and come to an agreement. Probably the most famous example of a cartel is OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, in this case, we're not talking about specific businesses or firms forming the trust or cartel, but actual countries that have state-owned oil companies or oil production facilities that have banded together in a formal organization to set world prices for barrels of oil and production levels. Now, there are 4 requirements for a cartel to be successful in the international market. First, it must control a large share of actual and potential output of the good or service so that other producers will not be able to lower prices by increasing supply. If I recall correctly, there are 9 countries participating in OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and OPEC and the 9 nations control upwards of, I think it's about 80% of the world's oil production. So OPEC certainly fits the bill in terms of this requirement. The second requirement is that poor substitutes for the product must exist. Well, that's pretty easy when we think about the oil industry. There's really no substitute for oil. So we have this requirement being met for OPEC. And the third requirement is that few outside factors exist to disturb cost or demand. There's very little that can go on in the world, including wars, pretty much, that would have an effect on demand for oil. That's pretty steady, and OPEC, using them as an example, certainly meets that requirement to be successful as well. And the fourth requirement for a cartel to be successful is that the cartel must be in a position to easily maintain control of the group and punish any members or then exclude any members who wind up cheating. Again, for those of you who are using the custom study guide and have the summary document, we're now in a position to wrap up that document by adding the highlights and characteristics of the oligopoly market structure. So, here we have 4 to 5 firms in a market that are controlling upwards of 70 to 80% of the output for a market. These firms are also price makers. They do have control over price in the market. There are some barriers to entry because these are big businesses with, in many cases, highly technical or complex product and service offerings and are very capital-intensive businesses. There is little differentiation in these products. Everything is pretty much the same. It's nowhere near what we see in terms of differences for substitution purposes like we see in the monopolistically competitive markets. So we have very close to being what is almost a commodity type of approach to the products. No price competition here. Price competition spells death for any firm that starts to engage in that. And again, as I had mentioned, we'll look into that a little bit more as we conclude this chapter and after we finish this chart. And an example of a market that's an oligopoly would be airlines.